So we got a message sometime last week asking for a little bit of guidance on how to debate politics. And the reason why was the person who contacted us was working on DC representation and said that it's really, really easy to find evidence that it would just be a scorched earth political battle because the Democrats really want for DC to have voting membership in Congress and the Republicans really want for DC not to have voting membership. And so the person who was trying to put together another strategy for DC representation, thought that getting up to speed to debate politics was probably the strategy of choice. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the way that politics is debated on the college level today, and then I'm going to make some recommendations if you want to go ahead with a politics debate based on where I see things right now. And then I'm going to have a couple of precautions, just really based on the difference between how college debate works and my understanding of how NCFCA debate works. So to begin with, political disadvantages. I would say these days you are probably going to hear one of about 4 variations on politics disadvantages. One of them is, well, they all take the form of there is something that either needs to pass, and if it doesn't, there's impact evidence that that'd be catastrophic. Very commonly it's a trade agreement, and you can find evidence that if the trade agreement or if the trade negotiating authority, fast-track negotiating authority, does not make it through Congress, then likely there's going to be trade disputes that flare up into rounds of retaliation and trade wars, and that will cause economic collapse, and then the impact is that economic collapse leads to war. Or sometimes it goes the exact opposite direction, and there's something that's being proposed, and the plan changes the political balance to where it passes, and the thing that passes is catastrophically bad. And I think over the past few years, sometimes it's been the Keystone Pipeline, and so the impact to that then is destruction of the ecosystem and cascading species extinctions and then death of all life on planet Earth. And these are the kinds of impacts that they have in college debate, where they need to be apocalyptic and they need to result either in nuclear war or in the elimination of all life. And I don't think, from what I gather, that those are the impacts that you typically use with your own negative arguments. But those are that's either this has to pass or there'll be a disaster, or if this passes there'll be a disaster. That's the most fundamental template of all. Now, where you get into variations are the internal links. How do you get to something either passing or not passing? And this is where I think there are 4 variations that you see pretty common. One of them is partisan gridlock. Partisan gridlock. So you start off by saying that whatever it is it needs to pass is there's a very, very delicate, fragile coalition supporting whatever this bill is that needs to pass. If we had started this discussion 2 weeks ago, I would have said that comprehensive immigration reform, that John Boehner had said that maybe this was the right moment to pursue it, and there were a number of leaders on both sides saying that there was a very, very little opening to get it done. And so what you then do is you have initial link evidence that the plan, when proposed and moved through Congress, will cause such a fierce partisan fight that it will poison the atmosphere, and the delicate coalition for this other piece of legislation or this other thing that needs to pass will fall apart, and then it won't pass. And if you could find something like that, it could be that if you want to debate DC representation, then partisan gridlock could be your internal link, because, as we've already established, Democrats really want it, Republicans really don't, and that's an easy thing to explain to a judge, that that is going to revive sort of the old retaliatory circles of partisan gridlock that have been going on for, well, really for the past decade or more. And one of the tricky things, of course, is winning uniqueness to any of this, but that's a separate issue that we'll take up when we've got the basic templates out there. The second one is political capital. And what that refers to is that the president has an agenda item, and that the president has finite political capital and has to use every scrap of political capital to get that bill through Congress. And what the plan does, because the plan is difficult, unpopular, controversial for whatever reason, you say that for it to get through, the president would have to use his political capital, would have to spend some of his political capital, and it thereby wouldn't be available to get this other item on his agenda done. And really which of those you go with, partisan gridlock or political capital, depends on when you find the legislation or something else like trade fast-track authority that is going to be at the heart of your disadvantage. Which are you finding the evidence for? That it is something both sides have reached a fragile, fragile compromise, a negotiated agreement to let it get through, or is it the case that the president is going to have to push it through and get it through over resistance? Whichever of those you find, then you put together your other internal link evidence and your initial link evidence, and that's the version of the disadvantage that you have ready to run. A third version is the one that I talked about before, that if the plan is popular, if you think that the plan is popular and that it's going to help the president get his agenda through, and there's some item on the agenda that would be really bad. Now, if you're getting this ready for DC representation, then I think that that's probably not the direction you want to run the politics argument. But it could be that there are other affirmatives being run on this topic, maybe making Election Day a national holiday, maybe, I don't know what else is out there that would be very popular, but something like that. You might want to put together the politics argument that when popular legislation gets through, the only operative in the federal government that everybody can identify on sight is Barack Obama, and so a lot of the people who do not follow DC and do not follow developments at the federal level, if something popular passes, they think, ha, Obama's doing a good job, and then all of a sudden it becomes easier for him to pass his agenda. So you might want to have a version of the politics disadvantage ready for affirmatives like that, like making Election Day a holiday or whatever else you think you could prove would be popular. And then the last is there is winners win. And at times over the years, I know that some people, in running their political disadvantages, they've been able to characterize if the plan passes, it's already identified with the president, and therefore the president will be seen as a winner. And you can find plenty of evidence written in commentary columns, in Washington Watcher columns, about how when you win, you get on a winning streak, and then other items of your agenda, it's more doable, more plausible that you're going to get those things passed. So, to recap real fast, partisan gridlock, political capital, popularity means you get your agenda passed, and a big win means you get your agenda passed. Now, the big, tricky thing, if you're going to win politics disadvantages, is winning uniqueness. What you've got to do, because these things are so finely tuned, is you need to go and you need to do a whole lot of searches, find everything written about whatever law or thing like fast-track authority is at the heart of your disadvantage, read absolutely every update article that has one member of Congress saying, I think it's going to be close, I think it's going to be tight. You get all the transcripts from the Sunday morning talk shows, and you try to find the best evidence you can that right now everything's going to be okay, but it's delicate. And really what you have to do is you have to attend to uniqueness for 2 and sometimes 3 different things. You have to attend to uniqueness for the internal link, and you have to attend to uniqueness for the impact, and sometimes for the initial link as well. So the internal link is, partisan gridlock. You need evidence that the state of partisanship at the moment, that it's improved, that there are some signs that the two sides are talking to each other, but that it has not become so improved. It hasn't become, the channels are not so open that the uniqueness is too big for the link, that the relationships, the temporary relationships forged between politicians on both sides would be able to weather the plan being passed. So you've got to first of all establish bipartisanship exists, bipartisan spirit exists temporarily, but it's very, very shaky. If you're going to argue political capital, then you need to argue that the president right now has just enough political capital to get something difficult passed, but it's really a close call. For the popularity helping them pass their agenda, you need to prove that the president is not very popular, but is not so unpopular that one law passing would not make any difference. And then finally, for winners win, you would need to prove that the president right now is on a little bit of a losing streak, that he hasn't had a win lately, and that he's not likely to have one in the near term. Then there comes the uniqueness for the actual impact. So you need to be able to prove that, if your impact is economic downturn, you need to prove that the economy is not going to inevitably turn down on its own. You need to prove, if it's going to be the XL pipeline, you need to prove that passage of the XL pipeline is not a done deal or out of reach, or that there are not other oil projects that are going to have the exact same consequences. And then finally, there's the initial link. You may need to prove if the plan is going to be popular or unpopular, you may need to prove that that perception has not already made it into the political sphere, that just whatever discussions have already happened haven't already triggered off whatever outrage, whatever political rebalancing is likely to happen. So it's always tricky, and at the college level, when debates go down on political disadvantages, very, very rarely is there a lot of debate about the impact. There are a few teams that might make their strategy that they're going to impact turn, or that they're going to be very ready for the impact debate on politics, but for the most part what they do is they try to have some very good uniqueness evidence available, and then they try to debate people on the link. And they will also do a lot of mocking and sometimes even critiquing the internal link, but the impact largely gets left alone. So let me talk a little bit about Thumpers, because if you go off to watch or read about how politics is being debated in college right now, they'll talk a lot about Thumpers, and they're not always good about explaining what a thumper is. There was a time when the way you debated a politics disadvantage on the affirmative was you said, in the status quo, the good thing that needs to get passed is not going to, but we will link turn your link, so we'll say the plan makes it more likely that it'll pass. And if you know the ins and outs of how to win a turn debate, you know that you can't win a link turn without winning uniqueness. Well, negatives got to where they were very, very ready for that, and they would put a lot of work every night at a tournament updating their uniqueness evidence, and they would know all their link arguments in great detail, and in the 2NC you would see a uniqueness wall with several of their very best pieces of evidence, and then a link wall with a very developed explanation of why there was a link. And it got to where affirmatives were finding it harder and harder to win by trying to win a unique link turn to a disadvantage. So what they did is they started arguing what, I don't know where this reference to Thumpers came from. I think it might have come from Dune. And if you've read the Dune series, you know what a thumper is, and I'm not going to take video time to explain it. But what they said is there are other things coming up, either that have already happened or that are going to happen soon, that will trigger the disadvantage, that have absolutely nothing to do with the affirmative. And sometimes if you just are cutting updates every day, if you're just treating it the way you would to be ready for extemp, and most college policy debaters do not do any individual events at all, so it's not like they're cutting for their extemp files, but if you know what's going on the domestic political scene, you could have 6 or 7 different thumpers at the college level. They go very fast, they have time to introduce all of those. You might just want to have 2 or 3, but things that are coming up that are very likely to set off political controversy, and then the negative has to be ready for all of them, and therefore can't just focus on saying, in the status quo, there's enough political capital, enough bipartisan support for this particular policy to pass. They can't just say, fast-track authority is going to squeak its way through in the status quo, because they have to fend off all of these external events that are coming up, and it gives the affirmative a little bit more control. It makes the negative have to be ready and have to be very good on a lot more issues. So it could be, if this is a negative strategy that you plan to pursue, and you're going to try to take down DC representation on politics, then you are going to need to have a very broad spectrum knowledge of what is going on in politics on the weekends that you are going to try to make this argument, so that you can fend off all of their various different thumpers. So they can't say that this issue, this upcoming event, it will trigger your disadvantage. Okay, what I think I would do if I were you, what I think I would go after between now really and the end of the season, you have to play it by ear, and you have to go out and read and do updated searches every single week before every single tournament, if this is going to be your strategy. But what looks good to me, to be perfectly honest, and partly because of something I'm going to talk about in a few minutes about your particular judging pool, I think I would make sort of the guts of my politics argument the Republicans retaking the Senate. And then you do a little reading, and I think you could find 4 or 5 different things that people will say will happen if the Republicans retake the Senate, all of which would be good things, and you have a little bit of a rhetorical edge with your natural judging pool. And I think what you say is, right now, moderate voters, I think you can find evidence for all of this, moderate voters are worried a little bit at how much obstruction they perceive the Republican Party has undertaken in Congress, and with moderate voters, the do-nothing charge is sticking a little bit, and you can find a lot of political commentators who will go into detail about why the Republicans, to win the Senate seats, to take back the Senate, they're going to have to be able to appeal to moderates. And so, I think you could say if there's a big outburst of partisan infighting, if the Republicans put up a huge fight over D.C. representation and then lose that fight, what that'll do is that will make it enough into the headlines that moderate voters will be turned off. I think you could say in the status quo, there are a few things that are starting to show signs that cooperation is a possibility. The Farm Bill, and as you read up, you'll find others, but that what the plan would do is it would change that image, that public branding that the Republican Party has for moderate voters, and then they don't take back the Senate. The other thing that you can do, and you can do this every week, is you can go to Evazon, E-V-A-Z-O-N, and part of me really rebels at recommending this, but this is one of the few, I think, legitimate applications, one of the few legitimate purposes for purchasing evidence, and that's to get an idea of what the argument looks like when people who are experienced, who've run it a lot, put it together. Evazon, E-V-A-Z-O-N, it's on crossx.com, cross-x, the letter x.com, and there are probably links to it other places as well. But every week they put up something called the Thursday file. The Thursday file is an old reference from college debate because you travel to tournaments on Friday, which means you put together your new politics disadvantage every Thursday night. You sit down and do a marathon online research session, and you have your new politics disadvantage. And they have Thursday files going up for the past several weeks. And you, as you get closer and closer to tournaments, what they do is they'll put up a little description of the Thursday file for that week, and you can keep an eye on what are the particular pieces of legislation, what are the events that are at the heart of their politics disadvantages, and then you can go out and try to reverse engineer and put together your own politics disadvantage. I think it's probably not a bad idea, because they only cost about $10, to spend the $10 one time to get a look at somebody's Thursday file. Not for the sake of running it, because boy, are you playing with a loaded weapon if you read evidence someone else cut and you have no idea who this person is, they're not in your club. If you were to read even one piece of evidence that's out of context, you are high and dry. You are a sitting duck, and that's not something I would ever recommend you do. But if you got a copy of the Thursday file for a particular week, read those cards carefully and look for the search terms you need. Look for the phrases that show up over and over again, and they'll have them underlined and highlighted, the words that you use to make those arguments. And you'll see that the words political capital get thrown around a lot. And you'll see that partisan cooperation and partisan gridlock, and there are other quick little verbal shorthands, and those become your search terms. And so that, I think, would be kind of a useful learning exercise in getting one of those together. You could also go to the Open Evidence Project run by the National Debate Coaches Association. Do a search in the Open Evidence Project for old politics files, the ones put together at the summer debate camps. And some of the ones that are very recent, you can find some of the very useful initial and internal link evidence that does not necessarily have to be brand new. Some of the stuff that comes out of political science journals, some of the stuff that explains why the president is the visible face of government, and sometimes that's one of the puzzle pieces that you need to make a disadvantage like that work. So comb through those, and if you're going to actually use any of that evidence, if I were you, I would go back and get the originals of those sources and look at the evidence in context. But that's a way that you can get a feel for how that argument is made. All right. So, one thing about politics disadvantages is they do tend to rub a lot of people very much the wrong way. And so, if I were you, that's a good strategy to pursue, probably a reasonably good strategy to pursue if you've got an alum judge, especially an alum judge who's gone on to be a college debater. But if you've got a community judge, there are all sorts of arguments that the affirmative can make that I think a community judge would give a very sympathetic hearing that the college debate world has sort of decided are not very good arguments and not to be taken seriously. So things like, this is playing politics as usual when people's well-being or people's rights are at stake, and just sort of orating about that. I mean, a college judge wouldn't give that a second thought. You know, go out and cut some evidence, go out and get a link turn strategy together. But I think you would have to think very carefully about how are you going to be ready for that argument. And then there's the argument, this is not an argument not to do our plan. This is just an argument not to do it right now. But, you know, why is it our burden to prove that it has to be a good idea right now, this week only? They are conceding away the merits of the plan, that the plan is a good idea. And if they concede that, if their only ground is to say, Right now, the political situation is not exactly ideal for passing the plan. The plan is still a good idea. You as a judge ought to just detach yourself from today's political exigency and affirm that we've found a good idea. It's just that we might have to wait until the political clouds clear up a little bit. And that's the kind of argument that I think they could get a very sympathetic hearing from a community judge on. I think it might help you a little bit if you've got something concrete and simple to understand, like the Republicans retaking the Senate. But I will say that when you want to win a debate on a politics disadvantage, really what you need to do is you need to, in a very vivid, very compelling way, narrate exactly the chain of events that happens. Don't just say that the plan would be controversial and would break up partisan cooperation. Name particular members of Congress and what their line will be when they go on the Sunday talk shows. Name particular constituencies that they will have to appeal to. Name particular big money donors who will put a lot of money into the game to make sure that something doesn't happen. Explain the motivation for all the fighting that will happen, because when you can turn it almost into an episode of The West Wing, which that's off the air several years, isn't it? I don't actually watch TV, so those illustrations never really work when I try to use them. But when you can bring it to life in the judge's mind to where the judge can almost follow event by event what's happening, that is when that becomes a fairly compelling argument. It's almost like debate blurs a little bit into extemp, because the affirmative has such an appealing argument to make to say this is ultra generic. These arguments are always made. They are always exaggerated. There's no reason to believe that there's any linkage in anyone's mind, the public or any political operatives, between our plan and this other piece of legislation that you have made the operating mechanics of your disadvantage. Nobody links DC representation with fast-track trade negotiation authority. No one can guarantee that there's going to be a trade-off, a quid pro quo between those two issues. So what you've got to do is you've got to make it so believable that the political situation is fragile, and anything that becomes a distraction throws off the very delicate balancing act that is being put together to get through whatever is at the heart of your disadvantage. If you can do that, in a very savvy way, then this could be a powerful strategy. But I'll tell you, if you're the kind of person who tags your cards and then reads the tag and doesn't really know the warrants in the evidence and can't explain them intelligently in cross-examination or in the speech time, then this is not the strategy for you, because you've got to be able to pull those elements out of the evidence and bring it to life. And if you're willing to do all of that, and if you'll go and have a look at someone's Thursday file, and if you will keep in mind that this is for people who are debate junkies, for people who've been around debate a long time, this is a very viable and very familiar, almost comforting strategy. But for community judges, it may come across just a little bit abrasive, a little bit like a bad reason, like that's your argument on the negative, that's why you don't think that we ought to adopt this. If you keep all that in mind and adapt to it, then it could be that you will enjoy some success with politics and you can take down DC representation or possibly other affirmatives as well. Good luck.